Modern History of Iran. Chapter 15. The National Liberation Movement in Iran, after the Great October Socialist Revolution in Russia. The State Revolution of 1921. The Great October Socialist Revolution, which marked a fundamental turning point in the world history of mankind, had an enormous revolutionary influence on the peoples of the East. It gave a powerful impetus to the development of the National Liberation Movement in Iran and other countries of the East and opened the epoch of liberation and national independence. Revolutions in colonial and dependent countries. J.V. Stalin writes that the October Revolution is the first revolution in the world that broke the centuries-old hibernation of the laboring masses of the oppressed peoples of the East and drew them into the struggle against world imperialism. The October Revolution unusually strengthened the positions of the colonial and dependent countries, in particular peoples of Iran, in their struggle against imperialism, for national independence. The very next day after the overthrow of the provisional government, the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets adopted a decree on peace, which also announced the cancellation of all unequal treaties. On November 24, 1917, signed by Lenin and Stalin, an appeal of the Council of People's Commissars to all working Muslims of Russia and the East was published, in which the foundations of the Leninist-Stalinist policy towards Muslim countries and peoples were proclaimed. The appeal stated that the Russian Republic and its government, the Council of People's Commissars, are against the seizure of foreign lands, that the treaty on the division of Persia has been torn and destroyed. As soon as hostilities cease, the troops will be withdrawn from Persia and the Persians will be provided with the right to freely determine their fate. In December 1917, the Soviet government published a statement on the evacuation of Russian troops from Iran, and from the beginning of 1918, the evacuation began. The Soviet government published secret treaties, concluded by Tsarist Russia, with England and other states that concerned Iran, and violated its rights as an independent state. The Soviet Republic returned to Iran everything that Tsarist Russia had taken from the Iranian people. The decrees of the Soviet government made a huge impression in Iran. Broad circles of the Iranian population enthusiastically greeted the news of the victory of the Great October Socialist Revolution. The peoples of Iran saw in the Soviet state their friend and ally. Under pressure from the Iranian public, the Shah's government was forced to declare its recognition of the Soviet government. Under the influence of the October Revolution in Iran, a new upsurge of the popular movement began. In 1918, local Soviets were formed in Rasht and Anzali on the initiative of Russian revolutionary soldiers. They included delegates from Russian military units and representatives of the Iranian population. Regarding these advice, Comrade Stalin wrote, "The revolution in Russia was the first to raise the oppressed peoples of the East to fight against imperialism. The Soviets of deputies in Persia, India and China are a direct sign that the age-old dormancy of the workers and peasants of the East is receding into the past." The organization of Soviets in Resht and Anzali gave a new impetus to the partisan movement of the Gengilis. The Soviets collaborated with the Gengilians, who resumed their struggle against the reactionary Shah authorities and against the imperialists. Now the Gengilians opposed the British. They put forward slogans, "Persia for Persians," "Down with foreigners," etc. The Gengilians captured the English consul in Rasht, Maclaren, the director of the branch of the English Shahanshah Bank Oakeshott, and the captain of the English intelligence, Noel Kuchek Khan, and the Gengilians actually dominated Rasht. Even before that, in Baku, Iranian workers founded the revolutionary organization, Adaliyat, Justice, which began to spread its influence to Iran. A new era in the history of Iran, which opened after the Great October Revolution in Russia, was characterized by the emergence of a young working class into the arena of political struggle, which gradually began to occupy a leading position in the anti-imperialist National Liberation Movement. The first trade unions arose in Tehran in 1918. The Organized Union of Postal and Telegraph Employees took an active part in the anti-imperialist movement. The Union of Bakery Workers, during the famine in Tehran, in 1918 established control over the price of bread. The Tehran Printers Union, which in 1918 numbered about 2,000 members, achieved the conclusion of a collective agreement, the introduction of an 8-hour working day, and improved working conditions. The British imperialists considered that the evacuation of Russian troops from Iran created favorable conditions for the implementation of their aggressive plans, the final enslavement of all Iran, as well as for the capture of Transcaucasia. In addition, the British sought to stifle the revolutionary movement in northern Iran and prevent it from spreading to other regions of Iran and further to India. Therefore, they decided to seize all of Iran in order to turn it entirely into their colony, then seize the Baku oil region and the Trans-Caspian region, prevent Soviet representatives from entering Iran, and turn Iran into a springboard for the fight against Soviet Russia. The American imperialists in 1918 to 1920, seeking to stifle Soviet power and seize Baku oil, also tried to seize the Transcaucasus in the form of establishing an American protectorate, or obtaining a mandate for the Transcaucasian territories, in particular for Armenia. The preparations for intervention in Iran and its implementation by the British were carried out under the flag of the struggle against the danger that allegedly threatened Iran, Afghanistan and India from the Germans and Turkish troops. At the beginning of 1918, an English expeditionary group of General Denstaville was sent to the north of Iran along the line Hamadan, Kazvin, Menzhil, Rasht, who was instructed to occupy Rasht, Enzeli, and then go to the Transcaucasus and capture Baku and Tbilisi. British troops led by General Malleson were sent to the northeast of Iran with the task of capturing the Trans-Caspian region. The British also began to arm merchant ships on the Caspian Sea. The population of Iran was hostile to the appearance of British troops in northern Iran. A campaign against the British occupation began in the Tehran newspapers under the slogans, "Down with the South Persian shooters," "Neutral Iran must be left alone," etc. There were rallies and demonstrations of protest against the violation of Iranian neutrality. The British in Iran were supported only by a part of the reactionary elite of the feudal aristocracy and compradors. The British also used detachments of Russian White Guards left in Iran, led by Bicharakov, who began to serve the British imperialists. Dunstaville's first attempt, at the beginning of 1918, to pass into Transcaucasia ended in failure. He managed to reach Rasht and Anzali, but as a result of opposition from the local council in Anzali and the Gengelis, he was forced to retreat to Hamadan. Then, having received reinforcements, artillery, armored cars and aircraft, Dunstaville, together with Bicharakov's detachment, again marched to the north. The poorly armed Gengelians could not resist the British armored cars, aircraft and artillery, and were forced to retreat. At the end of June 1918, Dunstaville occupied Rasht, and then Anzali. Local councils were crushed, and their leaders were sent to India. Kuchek Khan, surrounded by people associated with British agents, for example, Haji Ahmed Kesmai was close to the famous English agent Karim Khan of Resht, stopped the national liberation struggle, and on August 12, 1918, concluded an agreement with Dunstaville. He undertook to let the British through in Baku, to release the captured British, to supply the British troops with rice and other products, and to remove the German officer instructors from the Gengeli detachments. The British agreed to recognize the power of Kuchik Khan in Jalan. This agreement between Kuchik Khan and the British, which opened the way for them to Baku, was a betrayal of both the Soviet Transcaucasus and the national interests of Iran. In August 1918, the British interventionists, with the help of traitors, the Socialist revolutionaries, Dashnaks and Mensheviks, as well as with the assistance of the reactionary Iranian government and Kuchik Khan, invaded Baku under the pretext of protecting Baku from the approaching Turkish army. 26 Baku commissars were treacherously captured and taken to the Trans-Caspian, where they were brutally murdered by the British. Regarding this heinous murder of 26 Baku commissars, Comrade I.V. Stalin wrote in the article, "To the execution of 26 Baku comrades by agents of British imperialism, that these villainous murders could be committed only by imperialist cannibals who are thoroughly rotten and have lost all moral character." The conclusion of a treacherous agreement with the British undermined the authority of the leaders of the Jengelians among the population and ordinary partisans. The treaty with Kuchek Khan was a mere ploy for the British to achieve an end to the resistance of the Jengelians. Soon the British imperialists violated the treaty they had signed. Haji Ahmed Kesmai openly betrayed the Jengelis, going over to the side of their opponents. The British sent a punitive expedition against the Jengelians, who were forced to withdraw into the forests again. By the middle of 1918, the British had established their control over all of Iran. In early August 1918, an Anglophile cabinet was formed in Tehran, headed by Voseged Dole. Russian White Guard officers in the Cossack Brigade, at the request of the English General Ironside, were replaced by the British. The British especially tried to prevent Soviet representatives from entering Iran. In July 1918, by order of V.I. Lenin, the first Soviet diplomatic representative Kolomaitsev was sent to Tehran. Under pressure from the British, the reactionary government of Voseged Dole refused to officially recognize him. On November 2, 1918, the White Guards, on the instructions of the British, destroyed the Soviet mission. Its employees were captured and taken to India. Kolomaitsev managed to leave for Moscow. In 1919, the reactionary Iranian government submitted a memorandum to the Paris Peace Conference with aggressive claims to Soviet territory. The memorandum put forward a brazen demand for the transfer to Iran of all Azerbaijan, with the city of Baku, Armenia, Nagorno-Karabakh, part of Dagestan, with the city of Derbent, as well as the Trans-Caspian region with the cities of Krasnovodsk, Ashgabat, Merv, Khiva and others. Earlier, the Turkish Empire included territories up to the Euphrates, including the whole of Kurdistan with the cities of Diyarbakir and Mosul. These demands of the Iranian government were so extravagant that even the Paris Conference refused to consider them. With such hostile actions, the reactionary Iranian rulers, at the behest of the British imperialists, responded to the friendly and generous acts of the Soviet government towards Iran. Despite the obviously hostile attitude towards the Soviet Republic on the part of the reactionary Iranian government, the Soviet government, which was striving to help the peoples of Iran to free themselves from the semi-colonial position, continued its attempts to establish friendly relations with Iran. On June 26, 1919, the NKID addressed the Iranian government with a note entitled, "To the Persian People and the Persian Government," which again proclaimed the Soviet government's denial of all rights and privileges received by Russia from Iran, which put Iran in an unequal position. The note stated that the Soviet government was refusing in favor of Iran from payments on Tsarist loans and from concessions, as well as from the regime of capitulations. The note stated that the accounting and loan bank of Persia, all the railways, port facilities, post offices, telephone and telegraph lines in Persia that were in Russian hands were transferred to the use of a free and independent people. All other institutions or regulations that place the Persian people in a subordinate position or constitute interference in their internal affairs are destroyed or abolished. But the government of Voseged Dole, which was preparing at that time to sign the Anglo-Iranian agreement enslaving for Iran, hid this note of the Soviet government from the people. Kolomaitsev was again sent to Iran as a plenipotentiary representative of the RSFSR. Since Transcaucasia was occupied by the British, Kolomaitsev had to go to Iran in a roundabout way. The British were especially careful to prevent the arrival of a Soviet representative in Tehran, as this could prevent the signing of the already prepared Anglo-Iranian Agreement of 1919, which was supposed to turn Iran into a British protectorate. July 26, 1919, Kolomaitsev arrived on the island of Ashuraid, where he was captured by the Persian Cossacks. On the way to Bendagayaz, Kolomaitsev was killed by the White Guard Colonel Filipov with the participation of the British, with the knowledge of the government of Voseged Dole. Negotiations on an Anglo-Iranian agreement began in the autumn of 1918 and dragged on for many months. The British spent huge sums of money on bribes and bribing Iranian statesmen. Voseged Dole himself and other leaders of his cabinet received about £130,000. Subsequently, the British demanded that Iran reimburse them for the amounts they spent on bribery and bribes in concluding the agreement. The Anglo-Iranian agreement was signed on August 9, 1919 in Tehran, Wosageddol, without the permission of the Majlis, which was required by the constitution. Under this agreement, England received the right to send its advisors to all departments and ministries of Iran at the expense of Iran, who were to receive very wide powers. The creation of a mixed commission of British and Iranian officers was envisaged for the reorganization of the Iranian army. The instructor officers, as well as all weapons, equipment and ammunition, were to be sent from England at the expense of the Iranian government. These activities were to be financed by a loan of £2 million. Art, which England decided to grant to Iran, after the British official, the chief controller of Iranian finances, establishes control over the finances of Iran. The organization of a mixed Anglo-Iranian enterprise for the construction of railways and other roads on the territory of Iran, and the creation of a mixed commission to revise the Iranian customs tariff were also envisaged. Thus, the agreement of 1919 imposed by England on Iran was to completely subordinate Iran to England. It gave control of the Iranian army, finances, railway and road construction in general, customs policy, etc. to England. Only such overt British agents as Sayed Ziauddin came out in defense of the agreement. In his newspaper Rod, Thunder, Sayed Zia, who took an anti-Soviet position from the very beginning of the existence of Soviet power, zealously argued the advantages of turning Iran into a British protectorate. So, as early as 1919, Sayed Zia began, on the instructions of his masters, the British imperialists, slanderous anti-Soviet propaganda and praise of the imperialist policy of England. Without waiting for the approval of the agreement by the Iranian Majlis, the British began to implement it. An English financial mission arrived in Iran, headed by Hermitage Smith, who took the post of chief controller of Iranian finances. Military instructors also arrived. In 1920, on the basis of a clause in the agreement on the revision of the customs tariff, Iran was forced to sign the Anglo-Iranian Customs Convention, which established very favorable reduced import tariffs for British goods and very high, in fact, prohibitive tariffs for goods from Soviet Russia. In an effort to completely subjugate Iran, the British created the so-called Eastern Bank and the company Northern Oil, which tried to take over the northern Iranian oil. Projects were drawn up to organize various syndicates to carry out railway construction in Iran. The British dominated the Iranian market. Taking advantage of their monopoly position, the British set speculative prices for the goods they imported, bought up Iranian goods, bread, etc., and also speculated on them. As a result, the prices of basic necessities and foodstuffs have risen even higher. All this caused famine and epidemics. The British completely dominated Iran, cracking down on participants in the National Liberation Movement and supporters of Soviet Russia. They were shot, thrown into prison or sent under escort to Mesopotamia and India. The British established their control over the press, societies, and, in general, over the entire socio-political life of Iran. The protégés of the British occupied ministerial, gubernatorial and other posts. Iran only formally continued to be considered an independent state. In fact, he was subordinate to England. England has taken Persia, v.I., Lenin said as early as July 1919. Wosageddol was preparing to convene the Majlis, hoping to secure the election of such a majority through bribery and terror that would obediently approve the Anglo-Iranian Agreement of 1919. But due to a number of circumstances, this agreement was not destined to materialize. The British plans of turning all the countries of the Middle East into colonies of British imperialism, and enslaving Iran, by implementing the Anglo-Iranian Agreement of 1919 failed mainly due to Soviet Russia and its policy, the strengthening of the positions of Soviet Russia, and the Soviet-Iranian negotiations that began in the middle of 1920 on the conclusion of a Soviet-Iranian political treaty undermined the positions of British imperialism in Iran. The National Liberation Movement that unfolded under the influence of the Great October Socialist Revolution in Russia, in the northern regions of Iran itself and in the countries neighboring Iran, Turkey and Afghanistan also contributed to the failure of plans to turn Iran into a British colony. To some extent, the failure of the Anglo-Iranian Agreement of 1919 was also facilitated by the contradictions between the victorious powers. The United States and France opposed the expansion of Britain's colonial possessions, in particular in Iran. The United States, also striving for the colonial exploitation of Iran, tried to prevent Iran from becoming a monopoly colonial possession of England. The signing of the Anglo-Iranian Agreement of 1919 and the control of the British caused an increase in anti-British sentiment in Iran. Mass demonstrations and rallies against the agreement took place in the cities. Proclamations were circulated demanding the annulment of the agreement and the resignation of the Vosiged-Dole government. Leaflets were distributed in Tehran, with a proposal to Ahmed Shah not to return from abroad. Several secret societies sprang up to fight against the agreement. The whole country was engulfed in revolutionary ferment. The defeat of the foreign invaders by the Red Army and the restoration of Soviet power in Transcaucasia inspired the peoples of Iran to fight for liberation against the British occupiers and their Iranian henchmen. In April 1920, an uprising of Azerbaijani Democrats began in Tabriz, led by a participant in the revolution of 1905 to 1911. Sheikh Mohammed Kiabani. Sheikh Mohammed Kiabani came from a merchant family. He received a spiritual education and later was even the rector of the main mosque in Tabriz, took part in the Tabriz uprising of 1908 to 1909. And in 1909, he was elected from Azerbaijan as a deputy of the Second Mejlis. In the Majlis, Sheikh Mohammed Kiabani was a member of the democratic faction and opposed imperialist policies. During the First World War, Kiabani and his supporters were persecuted by the Shah's authorities, as well as by the Turks when they occupied Tabriz. After the conclusion of the Anglo-Iranian Agreement of 1919, Kiabani sharply opposed this agreement. He and his supporters demanded the annulment of the Anglo-Iranian Agreement, the convening of the Majlis as soon as possible, and the formation of a government of patriotic ministers that would be able to carry out reforms in Iran. Kiabani called for a fight against the old despotic Shah regime and against imperialist oppression. Under the leadership of Kiabani, a democratic party was created in South Azerbaijan, which set as its goal the national liberation of the country and the establishment of democratic order in it. The Democratic Party consisted of progressive representatives of the bourgeoisie, landlords and clergy, as well as artisans, intellectuals and other sections of the population. The Democratic Party published its own newspaper, Tajdid, Renewal, which published articles and speeches by Kiabani. On the pages of the Tajdid newspaper, Kiabani exposed the policy and maneuvers of the British imperialists and Iranian reactionaries, protested against the enslaving Anglo-Iranian Treaty of 1919, called on the Azerbaijani people to revolt against the Iranian and British enslavers, for the establishment of democracy and national liberation. Speaking out against national oppression, the Democratic Party of Azerbaijan demanded internal reforms, the development of education, the organization of the People's Army, the creation of a democratic government capable of protecting the interests of the people. In April 1920, Azerbaijani Democrats, led by Kiabani, raised an armed uprising in Tabriz against the reactionary Iranian authorities and the British imperialists standing behind them. Armed detachments of Democrats occupied government offices in Tabriz and expelled the Shah's governor and reactionary officials from the city. The broad masses of the people supported the insurgent Democrats. The gendarmerie, in whose ranks there were many participants in the revolution of 1905 to 1911, joined the rebels. Some other cities in South Azerbaijan also joined the Democrats. After the democratic upheaval in Tabriz, Azerbaijan was declared Azerdistan, i.e., the country of freedom. Kiabani and his supporters propagated the idea of creating an independent Azerbaijani democratic state, a bourgeois republic. Thus, the movement of Azerbaijani Democrats, led by Kiabani, was a national liberation movement. After seizing power, the Democrats took steps to improve the lot of the broad masses. In conditions of famine, a struggle was waged against speculation. Food prices were reduced and other activities were carried out in the interests of the people. The uprising of the Azerbaijani Democrats was of great importance for the development of the national liberation movement both in Azerbaijan and in the northern provinces of Iran. It also had a serious impact on the political situation in Iran, serving as an impetus for the resignation of the reactionary government of Vosiged-Dole, which followed in the middle of 1920. But, although the Kiabani uprising was an outstanding national democratic movement, the leaders of the Azerbaijani Democrats, in connection with their bourgeois narrowness, made a number of serious mistakes that weakened the power of the Democrats. Kiabani himself held a number of views that were erroneous and harmful to the development of the revolutionary movement. Thus, speaking in defense of freedom and human rights, Kiabani did not understand the decisive importance of the broad masses of the people in this struggle, and even treated the popular movement with fear and distrust. The common people are the slave of prejudices, he said. If the common people sleep, then they sleep at all, and when they wake up, they do not recognize gradual actions. Kiabani also underestimated the importance of violent methods of struggle, and harbored harmful illusions that one could achieve his goal by peaceful means alone. These wrong ideological attitudes led Kiabani to a number of serious mistakes. The supporters of the reaction in Tabriz, the feudal aristocracy, and other reactionaries, and even parts of the Persian Cossacks were not disarmed. The Kiabanists did not wage a decisive struggle against the reactionaries, who, thanks to this, were given the opportunity to freely conduct counter-revolutionary work in the city. To establish contact with the reactionary forces outside Tabriz, with the command of the Shah's troops. Underestimating the role of the popular masses, Kiabani and his supporters did not take measures to arm the people. Although there were stocks of weapons and ammunition in Tabriz since the World War, only small armed volunteer detachments were organized. Serious measures were also not taken to strengthen Tabriz. Nothing has been done in the field of agrarian reforms either. Kiabani did not establish contact with the revolutionary movement in other provinces of Iran, Jalan and others. He was distrustful of Soviet Russia, and sought to isolate himself from the Soviet Transcaucasus. Not wanting to understand that the policy of Soviet Russia towards Iran was fundamentally different from the policy of Tsarist Russia. For several months, the Shah's government did not take decisive measures against the rebellious Tabriz, but this inaction of the reaction was not used by Kiabani. He adhered to passive, defensive tactics, refusing offensive actions, although the ground for this in other regions of Iran was quite favorable. All these circumstances have weakened the position of the Azerbaijani Democrats. In the autumn of 1920, the Shah's government sent large military forces, which were well armed by the British, to suppress the Tabriz uprising. The British imperialists took every possible measure to stifle the movement of the Azerbaijani Democrats. With the leading participation of British representatives, and with British money, a counter-revolutionary conspiracy was organized in Tabriz from local reactionaries. Together with the Shah's troops directed against the Democrats, Mokber Saltain, newly appointed Governor-General of Azerbaijan, left Tehran for Tabriz. The troops, approaching Tabriz, stopped, and Mokber Saltain, in order to divert the attention of the Democrats, entered into negotiations with Kiabani. The negotiations dragged on for 10 days, during which new detachments of troops were drawn to Tabriz. Mokber Saltain was even admitted to Tabriz, where he established contact with the reactionaries and Cossack detachments, and also examined the fortifications erected by the Democrats. Returning to his camp and having completed all preparations for the offensive, he gave the order to the troops to move to Tabriz. The forces were unequal, and despite the desperate resistance of the Democrats, Tabriz was taken by the Shah's troops. The revolutionaries were brutally massacred. Kiabani himself and many of his supporters were torn to pieces. About 300 families of Kiabani supporters were persecuted by the reactionaries. In the autumn of 1920, the uprising in Azerbaijan was suppressed. The strongest national liberation movement in Iran, in 1920 to 1921, took place in Jalan. The immediate impetus for the beginning of this movement was the events in Transcaucasia. On April 28, 1920, the counter-revolutionary Musavatist government was overthrown in Baku, and Soviet power was restored. Under the blows of the Red Army, the White Guards and interventionists, capturing the military and merchant ships of the Caspian Fleet, fled from Baku to Anzali, which was turned by the British into a supply base for counter-revolutionary forces fighting against Soviet Russia. On May 18, 1920, the Soviet fleet, pursuing the Whites and the British and trying to return the Soviet property taken away by the Whites, appeared near Anzali and began bombarding British positions. And then landed. Indian sepoys and Persian Cossacks refused to fight the Red Army. The British were forced to flee from Anzali and then from Jalan. This was the beginning of the evacuation of British troops from Iran in general. The expulsion of the British and the White Guards from Jalan made a huge impression, not only on the population of Jalan, but also on the inhabitants of Tehran and other cities and regions of Iran. After the flight of the counter-revolutionary detachments, the Gengilis, led by Kuchek Khan, again left the forests and occupied Rasht and Anzali. Some Persian Cossacks joined the Gengilians. The Shah's governor of Jalan, the feudal aristocracy, and many reactionary officials and merchants fled to Tehran. Then the formation of the Jalan Republic was proclaimed. A provisional revolutionary government of the Gilyang Republic was created, headed by Kuchek Khan, who also took the post of military commissar. Signed by Kuchek Khan, V.I. Lenin was sent a greeting on behalf of the people, who took power in Jalan into their own hands. A united front was formed in Jalan, which included various groups. The Kuchek Khan group, commercial bourgeoisie and small landowners, the anarchist petty bourgeois intelligentsia group led by Esenollah Khan. The Kurdish group led by Karlu Kurban, mainly farm laborers and agricultural workers who worked for lands of the Jalan landlords, and a group of Iranian communists. On June 20 to 25, 1920, the first Congress of the Adalat Party was held in Anzali, at which a decision was made to rename it into a communist party. The Congress approved the basic slogans of the party for the next period: the struggle against the imperialists, the Shah's government, and the big landowning Khans, and decided to support Kuchek Khan, i.e., to create a united front. The Central Committee of the Communist Party was elected at the Congress. The government of Kuchek Khan set itself the following main tasks: the struggle against the imperialists and the expulsion of the British from Iran, the overthrow of the Shah's power and the capture of Tehran, the struggle against the big reactionary feudal lords. In accordance with this program, the government began organizing military units, which were called the Iranian Red Army. Having cleared Jalan from the Shah's troops, in July 1920, the Jalan detachments began a campaign against Tehran. They occupied the place Menzhill, located in the strategically important Menzhill Gorge, halfway to Kazvin. Then the revolutionary detachments also marched east along the coast of the Caspian Sea and reached Barfarash, now Babel. In addition, a detachment of troops was sent to the east on ships along the Caspian Sea, which landed in Meshadessa, now Nushaka. In the area of the agrarian question, the revolutionary government of Gila pursued a policy of confiscating the lands of large reactionary feudal lords who had fled to Tehran. Kuchek Khan was against the confiscation of landowners' lands in general and their division among the peasants. His slogan on the agrarian question was, as before, the demand for a return to the old democratic order of Islam, which did practically nothing for the peasants. Kuchek Khan and his supporters, reflecting the interests of the commercial bourgeoisie associated with landownership, were thus against resolving the agrarian issue. Among the Iranian communists at that time, petty bourgeois sentiments were still strong. Some of them did not clearly understand the tasks of the national liberation movement facing the party. Shortly after the formation of a united front, disagreements arose between Kuchek Khan and the Iranian communists, whose governing bodies had been infiltrated by treacherous leftist elements. Unwilling to reckon with the concrete historical conditions of Iran, they overestimated the degree of development of bourgeois relations in Iran and declared that Iran was already a bourgeois capitalist country. They put forward the slogans of a socialist revolution, and demanded the immediate confiscation of all landed estates, including the lands of small landowners. Esanollah's anarchist petty bourgeois group supported these slogans. In Rasht, Anzali and other points of Jalan, requisitions and confiscations began to be carried out without permission even from small landowners, merchants and artisans. Agitation was carried out against the Quran and the clergy, slogans were put forward for the immediate removal of the veil by women, etc. Such tactics were objectively beneficial to the imperialists and the Shah, since it undermined the united anti-imperialist and anti-Shah front. In the ranks of the Iranian communists, as it turned out later, there were English provocateurs, who were the authors of some provocative slogans, in particular slogans directed against the clergy. As a result, the united front in Jalan soon began to disintegrate. The bourgeoisie and the small landlords began to move away from the revolution. In Rasht, the bazaar was closed in protest against the requisitioning policy. Under pressure from the bourgeois landlord groups, Kuchek Khan demanded the liquidation of the Communist Party. On July 10, 1920, the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Iran, under the influence of leftist elements, made an erroneous decision to remove Kuchek Khan from power. On July 19, Kuchek Khan left Rasht and went with his troops to the area of the city of Fumen, into the forests. The bourgeoisie and the small landowners withdrew from the revolution, dragging part of the peasantry with them. The United Front broke up. On July 31, 1920, Esanollah and Karlu Kurban, together with the leftist elements of the Communist Party, arrested supporters of Kuchik Khan among the members of the government and the commanders of the Janjeli detachments in Rasht and Anzali. Then a new government was formed in Rasht, headed by Esanollah. Esanollah's government announced the confiscation and distribution among the peasants of the lands of all the landowners who had fled from Jalan, the reduction of the landlord's share when the peasants rented the land of the remaining landlords, and the abolition of other natural duties that the peasants were obliged to bear in favor of the landowners. But the announcement of the government of Esanollah about the confiscation and distribution among the peasants of the lands of the fugitive landowners remained an empty declaration. Esanollah's government did nothing to provide the peasants with seeds and working livestock. Moreover, there were cases when representatives of the government even took away the cattle from the peasants. Thus, the agrarian policy of Esanollah's government did not attract peasants to him, and caused sharp discontent among the landowners. The landlords gathered in Rasht to protest against Esanollah's policy, but were dispersed by machine gun fire into the air. The system of forced deliveries of rice by the landowners established by the government of Esanollah led to the fact that the landlords began to exact their share from the peasants in even larger amounts than before. Taxes were increased in cities and requisitions were made. The establishment of a system of distribution of taxes and requisitions through the top merchants and artisans led to an increase in the taxation of all artisans, small traders and other poor strata of the townspeople. By order of the government, vehicles were requisitioned from drivers and boatmen, unpaid labor of loaders was used, etc. Cordons were set up at the entrance to Rasht, which obstructed peasants carrying their products to the city bazaar. Without sufficient preparation, Esanollah in August 1920 undertook a campaign against Tehran, which ended failure. Between Menzhil and Kazvin, his detachments were defeated by the British and the Shah's Cossacks. Pursuing the Gilyang detachments, the Cossacks under the command of Colonel Staroselsky even occupied Rasht. Detachments of the Gilyans were also forced to retreat from Mazandaran. Rasht was cleared of Cossacks by the Gilyans only by the end of October 1920. Esanollah's policy repelled not only the small landlords and the bourgeoisie, but also the peasants and the urban poor from the revolution. Losing the support of the broad masses of the people, Esanollah took the path of an alliance with the feudal aristocracy. In the spring of 1921, he entered into an alliance with the large Talish feudal lord Zagama Sultan to jointly fight Kuchik Khan. Under this agreement, Zagam undertook to supply Esanollah with food, and Esanollah Zagama with weapons and ammunition. Esanollah's policy, which undermined the United Revolutionary Front, was harmful to the development of the revolutionary movement not only in Jalan, but throughout Iran as a whole. Realizing the harm to the revolution of the policy of Esenullah's government, the advanced elements of the Iranian Communist Party led the fight against him and the leftist group within the party. An important role in this struggle and in exposing Esenullah was played by the Congress of the Peoples of the East, held in September 1920 in Baku with the participation of delegates from India, Egypt, Turkey, Iran and Afghanistan. The leftist group of the Iranian Communist Party was condemned and crushed. The newly elected Central Committee of the Communist Party of Iran was headed by the Iranian worker Haydar Khan Amuoglu. Haydar Khan in the past worked at the Baku oil fields, then at the Tehran power plant. He took an active part in the Iranian Revolution of 1905 to 1911, in particular in the Tabriz Uprising. After the defeat of the revolution, he was arrested and was in prison, and then in exile, where he was one of the organizers of the Adalat Party. The new Central Committee of the Iranian Communist Party developed theses on the socio-economic situation in Iran and the tactics of the Communist Party, known as the Theses of Haydar Khan 1. The theses proceeded from the premise that Iran is at a transitional stage from patriarchal tribal and feudal life to capitalism. The theses proclaimed the rejection of the immediate implementation of purely socialist measures in Iran, as well as the need to conduct in the coming period, until the overthrow of the Shah's government and the expulsion of the British from Iran, the tactics of uniting all classes, from the proletariat to the middle bourgeoisie, in the struggle against the Shah, the big feudal lords and imperialism. The theses spoke of the need for cooperation with the left-wing Democrats, Sheikh Mohammed Kiabani, and an agreement with Kuchik Khan. The theses put forward the task of drawing the peasants into the struggle by means of an immediate radical solution of the agrarian question, the expropriation of large landowners in favor of the peasants. Further, the theses recognized the need to participate in the Iranian Majlis, to use it as a tribune, to conduct propaganda among the population without offending the religious feelings of the population, and also put forward the task of creating a revolutionary army to fight against the imperialists and the Shah. In September 1920, the Central Committee of the Iranian Communist Party withdrew its representatives from Esenullah's government in order to isolate him and expose his policies. The Communists remained only in command posts in the army. Then the re-registration of party members and work to strengthen local party organizations were carried out. On January 4, 1921, the appeal of the Central Committee of the Communist Party to the Iranian people was published, in which the following main tasks of the revolutionary movement in Iran were put forward. 1. The expulsion of the British and the struggle for the liberation of Iran from the rule of imperialism. 2. The overthrow of the power of the Shah, who was sold either to the king or to the British. 3. Declaration of Iran as a single, indivisible People's Republic. 4. The liberation of the peasants from the bondage of the landlords and the alleviation of their situation at the expense of the landlords. 5. Organization of a national army to fight against foreign imperialists and to maintain the unity of the Republic. 2. The demand to declare a multinational Iran as a single, indivisible republic testified to the Iranian communists' lack of understanding of the importance of the national question in Iran. They did not understand the need to combine the struggle against imperialism, the Shah and the feudal lords with the struggle for the liberation of non-Iranian peoples and tribes, as well as Iranian national minorities, from national oppression by the exploiting elite of the dominant people in Iran, the Persians. The underestimation of the national question was a serious mistake of the Iranian communists. The new Central Committee of the Iranian Communist Party again called for the creation of a united front, from peasants and workers to the middle bourgeoisie, and for cooperation between the Communist Party, the Janghelians, Kuchek Khan, the Kiabanists and other groups. Haydar Khan established contact with Kuchek Khan and began negotiations with him on the restoration of a united front. The revolutionary movement in Iranian Azerbaijan and Jalan, the successes of the national liberation movement in Afghanistan, and the beginning of the anti-imperialist movement in Turkey, and especially the victory of Soviet power in the Transcaucasus and Transcaspia, all these events had a very strong impact on the population of the capital and provinces of Iran. The revolutionary movement threatened to spread from the north to other regions of Iran. Sympathy for Soviet Russia and anti-imperialist sentiments grew among broad sections of the Iranian population. Speeches and agitation against the Anglo-Iranian Agreement of 1919 continued. Compromised by the signing of an agreement enslaving for Iran with England, the cabinet of Vosiged-Dole in June 1920 was forced to resign. It was replaced by the cabinet of the well-known Iranian nationalist Moshe ul-Dole, who was negative about the Anglo-Iranian Agreement and refused to recognize it, citing the fact that it was not approved by the Majlis. In September 1920, England presented a demand to Iran to immediately approve the agreement of 1919. To discuss the British demand in Tehran, an emergency council of prominent political figures, princes, former ministers and deputies, etc., representatives of the feudal aristocracy, under the pressure of popular indignation, did not speak in favor of approving the agreement and decided to refer this issue to the decision of the future Majlis. Simultaneously, in the fall of 1920, a representative of the Iranian government, Moshava el-Mamalek, was sent to Moscow to negotiate a political treaty between Iran and Soviet Russia. The Soviet-Iranian negotiations that began after his arrival in Moscow were successfully moving forward and were completed at the beginning of 1921. All that was left was to sign the contract. Back in November 1920, the Soviet government appointed its plenipotentiary to Iran. In January 1921, the Iranian government announced its agreement to receive the Soviet envoy. Thus, relations between Iran and Soviet Russia began to improve. Regarding the Soviet-Iranian negotiations, V.I. Lenin pointed out on December 22, 1920 in his report to the 8th All-Russian Congress of Soviets, "From the Yoke of Imperialism." Under the circumstances of the failure of the plans of British imperialism, the authors of the Anglo-Iranian Agreement realized that attempts to implement it could only lead to the strengthening of the national liberation movement and to the undermining of their positions in Iran. Therefore, the British imperialists decided to change their tactics and organize the overthrow of the government, which could no longer carry out a policy that was beneficial to them. In Tehran, a secret, so-called Iron Committee was created, headed by the well-known British agent and adventurer Sayed Ziauddin Tabatabai, who, at the behest of the British, organized a conspiracy. The conspirators established contact with the command of the Persian Cossack units, among which strong dissatisfaction was widespread at that time due to non-payment of salaries by the government. The most prominent role among the Cossack commanders at that time was played by Riza Khan, who joined the conspirators. Riza Khan was born in 1877. He was the son of a small landowner from Savadku, Mazandaran. He began his career in 1891 by serving in the lower ranks in the Persian Cossack Brigade. During the First World War, Riza Khan received a number of officer ranks. At the beginning of 1921, with the rank of lieutenant colonel, he commanded a regiment in a Cossack division. On February 21, 1921, units of the Persian Cossacks, under the command of Riza Khan, entered the capital and carried out a coup d'état. In fact, the actions of the Cossacks were led by English officers who were in the Cossack units as military instructors. The Cossacks seized government buildings in the capital and arrested about 200 Iranian dignitaries and prominent statesmen, mostly opponents of the British. A new government headed by Sayed Zia was formed, which was called the Black Cabinet in Iran. Riza Khan was first appointed commander of the Cossack division and then the Minister of War. Having become Prime Minister, Sayed Zia, in order to mislead public opinion, prevent the growth of revolutionary sentiments, and tear off the broad masses from the revolutionary movement in Jalan, published a broad demagogic declaration. The declaration proclaimed a struggle against the aristocracy that drinks the blood of the people and parasites. The intention to improve the condition of the workers and peasants and to give them fair compensation for their labor, to divide state lands among the peasants, to increase their share of the harvest at the expense of the landlords, and to establish fair relations between peasants and landowners, development of public education, industry, trade, transport, the creation of a strong national army, etc. A foreign policy independent of foreign powers, and the complete non-interference of foreigners in the affairs of Iran were also proclaimed. The declaration also announced the annulment of the Anglo-Iranian Agreement of 1919, the implementation of which, as it was quite clear by that time for the British, who led Sayyid Zia, seemed completely unrealistic. In fact, Sayyid Zia and the government headed by him did not carry out any reforms. This is not why Zia was brought to power. After the coup, the task was set before him by the British to prevent the growth of the national liberation movement in Iran and the development of friendly relations between Iran and Soviet Russia. But Sayyid Zia still failed to disrupt the signing of the Soviet-Iranian Treaty, negotiations on the conclusion of which had already been completed by the time of the coup in Iran. The establishment of normal relations with Soviet Russia was advocated by broad sections of the Iranian population, as well as by many merchants and landlords. The point is that the severing of ties with Russia did great harm to the landlords and merchants of the northern provinces of Iran, who had been economically closely connected with Russia for many years. The rupture of ties with Russia led to a sharp reduction in foreign trade, to a reduction in the area under crops, and to a drop in the incomes of landowners and merchants. Added to this was growing dissatisfaction with the unceremonious bossing of the British in Iran. Therefore, many Iranian landlords and merchants also demanded a speedy settlement of relations with Soviet Russia. On February 26, 1921, the Soviet-Iranian Treaty was signed in Moscow, which marked the beginning of a new stage in relations between the two countries. It was based on the Iran-friendly policy of Soviet Russia, which broke with the Tsarist imperialist policy. The agreement formalized the refusal of Soviet Russia from all treaties and agreements concluded by the former Tsarist government, which were detrimental to the independence and sovereignty of Iran. In particular, the rejection of the capitulation regime and the rights of extraterritoriality. The Soviet government declared its complete rejection of the financial policy pursued by the Tsarist government in the East, and renounced all rights to loans granted to Iran by the Tsarist government, declaring them invalid and unpayable. It also renounced all claims to the use of those Iranian state revenues that guaranteed these loans. The Soviet government donated to the peoples of Iran the accounting and loan bank of Persia with all amounts of money, valuables, with all assets and liabilities, as well as with all movable and immovable property of this bank located on the territory of Iran. Not wanting to take advantage of the results of the Tsarist predatory policy, the Soviet government handed over to Iran the Asharade Island and other islands in the Caspian Sea near the Astrabad province. Iran received the right to free navigation in the Caspian Sea. The Soviet government renounced all Russian concessions received under Tsarism and handed over to Iran Russian structures on its territory free of charge. The Anzali-Tehran and Kazvin-Hamadan highways with all the lands, buildings and equipment related to these roads. Railway lines Julfa, Tabriz and Sofyan, Lake Urmia with all buildings, rolling stock and other property. Piers, warehouses, steamships, barges and other vehicles on Lake Urmia with all property related to them. All telegraph and telephone lines built by the former Tsarist government on the territory of Iran with all property, buildings and inventory. Anzali port with warehouses, power plant and other buildings. The Soviet government also declared invalid all other concessions received by the Tsarist government or Russian subjects from the Iranian government, and from the moment the agreement was signed, returned to Iran all these concessions, as well as land plots received on the basis of them. The Iranian government undertook not to transfer these enterprises and concessions to other states or their subjects. Article 5 of the agreement established the mutual obligations of both parties. The purpose of the fight against Persia and Russia, as well as against the states allied with the latter, and likewise not to allow on its territory the recruitment or mobilization of personnel into the ranks of the army or the armed forces of such organizations. 2. To prohibit those states or organizations, however the latter may be called, which have as their goal the fight against another high contracting party, to import into the territory of each of the high contracting parties, or to transport through it, everything that can be used against the other high contracting party. 3. To prevent, by all means available to them, the presence on their territory of troops or armed forces of any third state, the presence of which would pose a threat to the borders, interests, or security of another high contracting party. Taking into account the experience of the past, when the British imperialists used Iranian territory as a springboard for an attack on Soviet Russia, and in order to prevent the Iranian territory from becoming a base for hostile actions against Russia in the future, Article 6 was included in the treaty, which provided that in the event that on the part of third countries there will be attempts, by armed intervention, to carry out an occupational policy on the territory of Persia, or to turn the territory of Persia into a base for military actions against Russia, if this threatens the borders of the Russian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic, or its allied powers, and if the Persian government, after a warning from the Russian Soviet government, it will not itself be able to avert this danger, the Russian government will have the right to send its troops into the territory of Persia in order to take the necessary military measures in the interests of self-defense. The conclusion of the Soviet-Iranian Treaty of 1921, which is still in force today, was of great importance for Iran. It was the first equitable treaty concluded by Iran after long decades of domination by the capitulation system. The Soviet government, signing this treaty, was guided by a sense of friendship for the Iranian people and respect for the independence and sovereignty of Iran. The Soviet-Iranian Treaty of 1921 was a manifestation of the disinterested and generous policy of the Soviet government towards Iran. Rejecting Tsarist loans, various facilities and concessions, the Soviet government donated over 100 million rubles worth of valuables to Iran. Gold. The transfer of these values to Iran, as well as the Soviet government's voluntary renunciation of the capitulation regime and all the rights and privileges received from Iran by the government of the former Tsarist Russia, which placed Iran in an unequal position, created exceptionally favorable opportunities for Iran to strengthen its economic and political independence. The Soviet-Iranian Treaty of 1921 testified that in the face of Soviet Russia the peoples of Iran had a great friendly country, rendering them every possible assistance in strengthening the economic and political independence of Iran and the well-being of its peoples. Based on this agreement, Iran subsequently, in 1928, achieved the abolition of the capitulation regime and the introduction of an autonomous customs tariff, etc. The Soviet-Iranian agreement could become a support for the liberation of Iran from economic and political dependence on the imperialist powers, and above all, on England. The treaty, which created exceptionally favorable conditions for the independent economic and political development of Iran and the strengthening of its independence, was greeted with joy by the entire progressive Iranian public. But if Said Zia could not prevent the signing of the Soviet-Iranian Treaty, then, while in the post of Prime Minister, he by all means disrupted friendly Soviet-Iranian relations and the implementation of the signed treaty. Acting on instructions from the British, he did not even allow the full text of the treaty to be published in Iran. He tried to prevent the Soviet ambassador from entering Iran by detaining him at the border. On his instructions, the Iranian authorities on the ground pursued a policy of persecution, arrests, and expulsion of Soviet citizens. The reactionary policy of Said Zia, pursued in the interests of British imperialism, aroused the indignation of progressive national democratic circles. Newspapers spoke out against him, proclamations were distributed. In Tehran's Shah Mosque, mass rallies were held to protest against his policies. At the same time, contradictions intensified between Said Zia and the Minister of War, Riza Khan, who claimed the role of dictator. Ahmed Shah was also dissatisfied with Said Zia. In the end, in May 1921, Said Zia was forced to resign and fled from Iran to Baghdad under the protection of his British patrons. After the flight of Said Zia, a cabinet was formed headed by the brother Voseged, known for his reactionary moods, a large Jalan feudal lord, the owner of huge tea plantations in Lahijan Kavama Sultan. In this cabinet, Riza Khan retained the post of Minister of War. By that time, Riza Khan had already concentrated in his hands the command of both the Cossack division and other military units, and the gendarmerie. Gradually, he extended his influence to civil administration, sending his officers to the posts of regional governors. From that time on, he began to turn into the de facto dictator of Iran. Together with Kavem Sultan, he gathered forces to suppress the national liberation movement in Jalan and the uprising of Muhammad Taghi Khan, which broke out in 1921 in Khorasan. Events in Jalan, meanwhile, unfolded as follows. It was said above that at the beginning of 1921, the leader of the Iranian communists, Riza Khan, began negotiations with Kuchik Khan on the restoration of the United Front. In May 1921, at the initiative of the Central Committee of the Iranian Communist Party, a unifying meeting of representatives of the groups of Kuchik Khan, Esenollah, Karlu Kurban and Iranian communists was held in Fumen. As a result of the agreement reached at the meeting, a new government was created, a revolutionary committee, in which Kuchik Khan took the post of chairman and commissar for financial affairs. Riza Khan, the post of commissar for foreign affairs, Karlu Kurban commissar for military affairs. Jalan was declared a Soviet republic. The government set itself as the main task the organization of the revolutionary armed forces and the transformation of Jalan into a base for an offensive against the reactionary government in Tehran. It also took a number of measures to improve the situation of the people in the field of health, public education, etc. It began organizing new schools, as well as orphanages for orphans and children of partisans. To combat illiteracy in the villages, educational councils were created. A youth union was organized, several newspapers were published, mass rallies were held to explain the situation in Iran and the reactionary policy of the imperialists and the Shah's government. But the unification achieved was fragile. Fighting soon resumed between the various groups. Esenollah, dissatisfied with the fact that he was deprived of the leading role of chairman of the government, in June 1921. Without the knowledge of the Revolutionary Committee, and without any military and political preparation, began a campaign against Tehran, which ended in the defeat and flight of his troops. Esenollah's disorganizing action opened the front to the Shah's troops, who, pursuing his detachments, again approached Rasht. The Revolutionary Committee issued an appeal condemning Esenollah's behavior, and removed him from its membership. After that, Esenollah with his detachments again retired to Lahijan. Esenollah and the treacherous elements carried out provocative activities, with the aim of disintegrating the United Front. Disagreements also began between Haidar and Kuchik Khan. Esenollah's provocative speech led to the fact that the hesitation of Kuchik Khan, who had repeatedly abandoned the national liberation movement and embarked on the path of collusion with the imperialists and Iranian reactionaries, intensified. Kuchik Khan refused to publish the program of social reforms worked out by Haidar. In particular, Kuchik Khan objected to the unfolding of the agrarian revolution and the confiscation of landowners' lands. He protested against harsh articles in the Jalan newspapers directed against the imperialists, the Shah's authorities and reactionary Iranian circles. After Kuchik Khan refused to publish Haidar's program, the latter published it on his own behalf. The fluctuations of Kuchik Khan and the differences in the revolutionary camp were used by agents of the imperialists and Iranian reactionaries. They established contact with Kuchik Khan and tried to impress on him that the Iranian communists did not intend to sincerely cooperate with him, that they only wanted to use him and then kill him. In particular, Sheikh Ahmed Sigari, who was close to Kuchik Khan and associated with the British, actively acted in this spirit. These provocative intrigues had an effect, and Kuchik Khan, who had previously been inconsistent, began to prepare for a fight against Haidar and his supporters. Riza Khan relied mainly on the Anzelian port workers and the semi-proletarian, artisan part of the population of Anzali and Rasht. He launched an energetic activity to unite the progressive forces and tried to win the peasants over to his side. In order to strengthen the positions of the Communist Party, Haidar set about organizing a special communist detachment. The influence of the Communist Party in Jalan increased noticeably. Thus, by the autumn of 1921, the United Front in Jalan had actually broken up again. The Thumen region was occupied by Kuchek Khan. Karlu Kurban was in Rasht with his troops. Anzali was the main base of Haidar. Esanola was in Lahijan. In the end, in fear of the further growth of the influence of the communists, Kuchek Khan embarked on the path of open treason and betrayal. On September 29, 1921, he invited Haidar Khan and other leaders of the Communist Party to a meeting in a village near Thumen. During the meeting, supporters of Kuchek Khan set fire to the house where the communists were and treacherously attacked them. Haidar Khan and his comrades were killed. At the same time, the Kuchakovites attacked the communists in Rasht and Anzali and crushed their organizations. The betrayal of the handfuls of Khan had a corrupting effect on the Jengelians. Their camp was in disarray. Karlu Kurban betrayed the Jengelians and went over to the side of the Tehran troops. Demoralization began in the detachments defending Jalan. Taking advantage of the confusion among the Jengelians, Kavamasaltain and Riza Khan at the end of 1921 moved units of the Persian Cossacks against them, who dispersed the Gengelist detachments and occupied the whole of Jalan. Kuchek Khan himself fled to the mountains, where he soon died. Thus, by the end of 1921, Kavamasaltain and Riza Khan managed to put an end to the national liberation movement in Jalan. Almost simultaneously, the uprising of Muhammad Taghi Khan in Khorasan was suppressed. In this province, the feudal yoke was even stronger than in other northern provinces of Iran. Almost medieval orders dominated here. There were large semi-independent khanates. The population suffered from the unpunished arbitrariness of the feudal lords. The discontent of the population was also reflected in the mood of the military units, the rank and file of which consisted mainly of peasants. In 1921, the military units in Khorasan were commanded by Colonel Muhammad Taghi Khan. During the First World War, Muhammad Taghi Khan was a prominent participant in the movement of Iranian nationalists against the Tsarist and British troops. After the end of the war, he emigrated to Berlin, from where he returned to Iran in 1920. Immediately after returning to Tehran, Muhammad Taghi Khan found himself in the center of opposition and anti-imperialist circles. In Tehran, he was contacted by the provocateur Sayed Zia, who, at the behest of his British masters, sought to use the discontent of the nationalist elements in their interests. For this purpose, Sayed Zia moved in nationalist circles and demagogically pretended to be a Democrat, an opponent of foreigners. To some extent, Sayed Zia's demagoguery was successful. He managed to get in touch not only with Colonel Muhammad Taghi Khan, but also with other nationalist-minded figures, for example, with the poets Eshki, Ev, and others. The Iranian authorities and the British were concerned about the appearance of Muhammad Taghi Khan in Tehran, where there was already strong discontent and fermentation, especially in connection with the conclusion of the Anglo-Iranian Agreement of 1919. Therefore, in order to remove him from Tehran, Muhammad Taghi Khan was appointed commander of the troops and gendarmerie in one of the most remote provinces, Khorasan. After arriving in Khorasan, Muhammad Taghi Khan subjugated not only the troops and the gendarmerie, but also began to establish his control over the civil administration. The Governor-General of Khorasan at that time was Kavamasaltain. Kavam was closely associated with the British, and the Mashkt newspapers even wrote that he was preparing, on the instructions of the British, the separation of Khorasan from Iran. At the same time, Kavamasaltain, known for his power-hungry aspirations, was in hostile relations with Sayed Zia, whom he considered his rival on the path to power. Relations between Kavam and Muhammad Taghi Khan were also hostile. After the coup organized by Sayed Zia on February 21, 1921 in Tehran, and outwardly held under the banner of fighting against reactionaries and agents of foreigners, Muhammad Taghi Khan arrested Kavam as a representative of the reactionary feudal aristocracy, known for his connections with foreigners, and sent him to Tehran. In the summer of 1921, after the flight of Sayed Zia from Iran and the formation of the cabinet of Kavamasaltain, Muhammad Taghi Khan openly refused to obey the Tehran government. The uprising of Muhammad Taghi Khan was directed primarily against the government of Kavam, whom he considered an agent of the British. Mashhad newspapers, under the influence of Muhammad Taghi Khan, called for a fight against the British, for the liberation of Iran from the yoke of imperialism, for the country's independence. They demanded the convocation of the Majlis, freedom of speech, as well as regional autonomy for Khorasan. Muhammad Taghi Khan acted as a supporter of the constitutional monarchical system. He stated that the ministers and officials, about whose abuses the Shah knew nothing, were to blame for the situation in Iran. Although Muhammad Taghi Khan did not put forward any slogans on the agrarian issue, however, after the uprising of the military units led by him, a peasant movement began to unfold in the regions of Khorasan. The peasants refused to fulfill their duties in relation to the landowners and pay taxes, seized the landowners' lands, food supplies, etc. The detachments of Muhammad Taghi Khan and the peasants were opposed by the Khans of nomadic tribes, incited from Tehran by Kavam, with their detachments. Clashes broke out between them. In the autumn of 1921, government troops were moved from Tehran against Muhammad Taghi Khan and the peasant detachments. Detachments of Khorasan Kurds joined the troops. In October 1921, the uprising in Khorasan was crushed. In late October, early November 1921, Muhammad Taghi Khan died in battle with the Bojnurd Kurds. However, after that, for almost a whole year, scattered partisan detachments fought against local reactionary feudal lords and authorities. Despite the defeat of the national liberation movement in the main centers, the resistance of democratic forces in other provinces of Iran continued. In February 1922, Kiabani's supporters again raised an uprising in Tabriz. This speech was directed mainly against the Governor-General of Mobra Sultan, who carried out a brutal massacre of the participants in the uprising of Sheikh Mohammed Kiabani. The February uprising of 1922 in Tabriz was led by the democratically minded officer Lahuti, who took part in the Iranian Revolution of 1905 to 1911. At that time, the gendarme detachments, especially in the north of Iran, were more closely connected with the masses than other military units. After the suppression of the Iranian Revolution of 1905 to 1911, many Fidai entered the service of the gendarmerie, and this was reflected in the mood of the gendarmes. After fighting with the Persian Cossacks, a detachment of rebel gendarmes led by Lahuti occupied Tabriz. The gendarmes demanded the removal of Riza Khan, the abolition of the reorganization of the army undertaken by Riza Khan, and the payment of their delayed salaries. The rebel gendarmes were joined by democratic groups of the population of Tabriz, who organized the Nationalist Committee, Renewal. These groups acted under the slogans of democratization of the country, national liberation, and reorganization of the state administration. But soon Tabriz was surrounded by large forces of Iranian Cossacks. After a 10-hour artillery shelling and battle, Tabriz was occupied. Lahuti and some of his supporters managed to escape the massacre and emigrate from Iran. By the beginning of 1922, the main centers of the national liberation movement in Iran had been crushed. National Liberation Movement, 1920 to 1921 in Iran, it was an anti-imperialist movement that had not yet passed into the agrarian stage. Many circumstances contributed to the defeat of the movement. The weak, newly emerging Iranian working class could not fulfill the task of uniting all anti-imperialist and anti-feudal forces. The provocative work of the petty bourgeois groups in the national liberation movement in Jalan significantly contributed to the weakening of the revolutionary forces and made it easier for the reaction to crush the revolutionary movement. This provocative activity prevented the main masses of the peasantry from being drawn into the struggle. The Iranian bourgeoisie, headed by Kuchik Khan, embarked on the path of struggle against the communists, who were the most consistent force in the national liberation movement. The lack of unity in the revolutionary camp was one of the main reasons for the defeat of the national liberation movement in Jalan. To a large extent, the defeat of the National Democratic Movement in Iran in 1920 to 1921 also contributed to its territorially limited nature. The uprisings in Azerbaijan, Jalan and Khorasan took place separately. There was no connection between them, which made it possible for the Iranian reaction to suppress them one by one. Finally, the fact that the revolutionary movement was opposed not only by Iranian reaction, but also by the British imperialists, who directed the actions of Iranian reaction and rendered it great help in suppressing the movement, was also of great importance. National Liberation Movement, 1920 to 1921, in Iran, took place under the direct influence of the Great October Socialist Revolution in Russia. It was of great importance in the history of Iran. The victories of Soviet Russia and the National Liberation Movement in Iran saved the country from British occupation and its transformation into a British colony. The Qajar dynasty, which headed the reactionary feudal aristocracy, was dealt a mortal blow. The peoples of Iran have gained new, valuable experience in the political struggle against imperialism and internal reaction for national independence and freedom.